Now, back in 1965, the AEC, Atomic Energy Commission, precursor to NRC and DOE, they did an inspection at the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation, known as NUMEC, in Apollo, Pennsylvania, my home state. And they discovered more than 100 kilograms of material unaccounted for. So, we're talking well over 200 pounds worth of material. And you can make several nuclear bombs from that material. And it wasn't until 12 years later, 1977, that Congressman Dingell, who was then the chairman of the House's Subcommittee on Energy and Power at the Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce, requested the GAO to investigate this so-called NUMEC affair. And what did the GAO find out? Well, they found out that their allegations, there are four of them. So quickly, material was allegedly illegally diverted to Israel by NUMEC's management. So Mr. Shapiro was the CEO of the company. He had a lot of connections to Israeli defense officials and others in the Israeli nuclear establishment. And we know a number of those Israeli officials visited the NUMEC facility during that time period. Second point, material was allegedly diverted to Israel by NUMEC's management with the assistance of the CIA. Well, that's a damning allegation. I don't know if there's any serious evidence there. Not much. I really recommend reading Victor Belinsky and Mr. Maxon's article from a few years back, which goes into much more depth. This is just a thumbnail sketch. And there's an alleged cover-up of the NUMEC incident by some agencies of the U.S. government. Another very damning allegation. And then the other allegation was that Israel had the acquiescence of the United States in this alleged diversion. So the good news is that at least this incident eventually put pressure on the U.S. government to improve the safeguards program and the accounting program of its military nuclear material. And it took until the late 1970s to really make that happen. So conclusions. All right, so it's adequacy of timely warning and a willingness to act. So if we get these warning signs, you want to get warning signs so you have enough time to actually intercept the material or to go in and try to track it down. If months or years, in the case of the NUMEC investigation, 12 years went by before we investigate this, good luck trying to get the material back, intercepting it. So you have to, Tom Cochran here, he would point to an earlier work he did for Henry and show that you have to have at least a week or 2 weeks warning to be able to intercept this material. It's in a metallic form that can easily be made into the core of a nuclear device. And really, none of the accounting lapses detailed in my paper did we have anywhere close to a couple of weeks warning. Often months or sometimes years would go by before we had any warning signs that something was amiss. So I think that's really the main takeaway from the paper. And Henry, you want me to add anything else?
No, I think as excellent as our system is, presumably the Russian and Chinese systems are much better.
Maybe.
By the way, if you want to cooperate, it's a hard sell right now, but you might focus on, accounting practices. I don't know that we do. Well, I've never really understood exactly what all that cooperative threat reduction stuff was about, but it would be worth finding out whether that is being something that we share our best practices on accounting. And how you would find out whether they were using those practices, I don't know. But it would be interesting if we're sharing them. Now, we went from bad to, maybe not so bad, and we're still in not so bad.
I'm
but
going to
not
quarrel
great.
with that assessment.
How should
I have to say
is
it's as bad as it
Is
gets.
it bad? Really bad, and what do you say? You're going backwards again. It's as bad as
I
it gets.
think it's pretty bad.
It's pretty bad.
Talking
There you go.
about-
Let's-
It's less
Pretty
material,
bad.
but it's not even nominally under the control of the government.
Okay, but let's make sure they know what you're talking
Yes.
about. Mr. Lyman many years ago, wrote a piece on civilian production of plutonium and actually highly enriched uranium, and how well the safeguard system internationally works to keep account of things and whether there's material unaccounted for. So he's still keeping current on this, and we have a chapter on it.
Henry, before we jump there, could I interject something right quick, just to make sure I understand? We have basically 6 metric tons of
Right.
highly enriched uranium.
And plutonium that we can't
plutonium
account for.
missing.
Right,
And is
most
it
likely
from-
it's in waste streams, and, you know, I don't think it's in some kind of
It's
terrorist
not
hands.
a
Yeah.
tank sitting somewhere.
No, no. The
No,
good
it might
news-
be in Hanford, might be some in tanks there, yeah.
The good news is, we're not making any more, and we haven't heard any NUMEC stories recently. Probably they're over with, and we have better accounting systems. But it does suggest our history is not glorious. And no, finding that will be a real mission impossible. That's a lot of stuff. By the way, if you divide by 3 to 4 kilograms, that's a lot of stuff.
And also, you put it in perspective, those 6 metric tons are roughly 1% of the total amount of material we produced.
That's the good news.
That's the
Bad
good
news
news.
The bad news
But-
is
and
that we produce so much.
So much, you know, when you're talking metric tons, you can make, you know, hundreds or maybe 1,000 more weapons from that.
Henry once compared the accounting to this to accounting for steam. Remember when you told me that, Henry?
Well, actually, that gets to Mr. Lyman's presentation,
Okay.
which is that when you're dealing with plutonium, you're dealing with its recycling and manufacture into fuel. You're talking about stuff in solution. You're talking about, in the case of enrichment, stuff that actually isn't a gaseous form. And you're talking about powder. And last I checked, it's a lot harder to keep track of that than it is multiple ton steel structures, which is mostly what fuel assemblies are. And so it's a very much tougher project. And on that note, Ed, take it away.
One more thing, do you know
Yeah.
who is in charge of any type of accounting mechanism, best practice accounting mechanism in our government? Is it centralized? or-
Yeah, DOE, and I didn't have time to go into it right now, but in my paper, if you want to read it, staff would read it, but basically, you know, DOE has a really good accounting system in place. It took many decades, but it's the NMMSS is the acronym. And, you know, every facility has to have, you know, detailed records, material going in, material going out, tracking it. And they report it to the central database.
If you will, the doors now are very well locked.
Okay.
The only problem is a 6-ton cow got out.
Thank you.
Okay.
So as bad as things are in the military sector, when civilian facilities process materials like plutonium, they have the same problems. And whenever you process nuclear material in what's called a bulk handling facility, it's intrinsic that you're going to lose accounting for some of that material for some period of time. Now, the premise of the international safeguard system is that you will have timely warning if there's a diversion or a theft of, in the case of plutonium, 8 kilograms, that you can detect that it's been diverted or stolen within 1 month if it's all taken at once, or within 1 year if you take it out in small bits. And that is a fallacy because no large bulk handling facility anywhere in the world can guarantee that you will be able to detect that material when it's missing. And so the history of the operation of facilities like these in countries like Japan, France, or the UK have shown repeatedly this threat in practice. And yet the Obama administration still refuses to take on its allies on the issue of the production of plutonium, and to even bring that up in the context of the Nuclear Security Summit is still considered dirty work. But in our view, if you're worried about nuclear terrorism, you have to worry about the inability to account for plutonium in civil facilities. And what's even worse is if you don't know something's missing, then you can't verify a threat. If someone calls in to your and says, we had an insider in that plant, we've taken out enough material for 2 nuclear weapons, we're we're gonna hold New York City hostage. They call up this facility and they say, can you verify that you still have all this material within 24 hours? The answer is going to be no. If you say, can you tell us within a week if that material is missing, it's most likely still gonna be no. Even a month, even 6 months, they may not be able to answer that question. That's why this is such a dangerous practice. So if you look at the history, in Japan, they have been processing plutonium for a couple of decades. They built a fabrication plant to turn plutonium into fuel for nuclear reactors. That was called the PFPF plant. In these plants, there's a lot of piping where powder can get stuck. There's equipment where it can adhere, and you can't go in every day and clean out all that material and account for it. You have to make assumptions about where it is. And when you do shut down the plant after, let's say, a year, some of that material is not going to be recoverable. And so what happened at this plant, when they started up, they started to experience this unusual material unaccounted for because it was adhering to the process equipment and the piping. And so after a couple of years of operation, there was 72 kilograms that they could not account for. And the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, was paralyzed because they don't like to put too much pressure on member states, especially those in good standing non-proliferation treaty like Japan. So it wasn't until the information about this material being missing was leaked to the press that the IAEA actually publicly acted. And then the Japanese had to shut down the plant. They had to take apart all that equipment. They had to scrape the plutonium out. Even after 2 years, they got down the amount missing to less than 10 kilograms. Still not below 8 kilograms, which was the indicator. So you have 2 years and you can't even meet their own standard. And that was a relatively small facility. It's not in the only in Japan that's the problem. The United Kingdom operates a civil reprocessing plant called Thorpe. They had an incident in 2004 where a vessel, a reprocessing plant is where you take spent fuel, you dissolve it in acid, you process it to separate plutonium. They had a leak in that first step before they even got to the point where they start measuring what they had. So they were losing plutonium in solution for months. And it was filling up in a sump. The sump was overflowing. It was setting off an alarm. They'd had a lot of these alarms in the past, so they ignored them. And so for many months, they were losing track of this plutonium. So these facilities are just, you cannot have the kind of timely warning that you need to resolve these kinds of issues. Now, is this a historical issue? Is the U.S. doing better? Well, I've also been studying the mixed oxide fuel fabrication plant that's under construction in Savannah Riverside. It's a controversial facility. There's arguments on both sides about it, but that's modeled after a French plant of a very similar design. And by studying the U.S. plant, I've come to the conclusion that the French MOX plant, which is called Melox, which processes about 190 metric tons of MOX fuel a year, has issues sort of what I described before, that because the way the plant's constructed, if someone said, we've stolen 10 or 20 kilograms from that facility, you would have a hard time actually trying to verify that statement because of the way the plant is built. And it's not just with stuff and pipes, it's the way the plutonium storage is built. And the U.S. version is almost a carbon copy of that. So this is the current state of nuclear materials accountancy, and it's not a pretty one. And in the context of the U.S.-Russian agreement, because we built this plant as part of a bilateral agreement with Russia, we are not setting a very good example for the Russian program, even if there were active cooperation right now. I wouldn't advertise the systems that we have in place because I don't think they're any good. So I guess I'll stop there.
Well, Russia has not proceeded though, right?
No, they have, actually. They built a fast reactor called the BN-800, and they've been manufacturing some plutonium fuel. I just read it was about 25% of the core is going to be MOX, and they fabricated that all outside of the U.S. Any kind of bilateral inspection. So we don't know, even if we had standards, we weren't able to make sure that they were enforced much.
By the way, this leads to our most optimistic presentation, but before we get at all upbeat, I thought I'd mention something.
You've done a good job of
Well,
addressing that.
believe me, this field is littered with optimism.
There's some optimism.
This one, I'm glad we're below ground.
Yeah. Well, by the way, once you get to the bottom, behind the bottom, underneath the bottom, you can start thinking about what you want to do, and the recommendations turn out to be different than what we're doing. Some of the things, by the way, you'll be happy to know, you guys are sort of middle of it. You too, specifically. So there's good news at the end of this tunnel, if you hang in. But before we get to that good news, it isn't just terrorists you got to worry about stealing this or insiders. The problem is that if you have a civil facility that you can incrementally get one bomb's worth out in a way that no one knows about, a country can go nuclear without setting off alarms. And once they've gone nuclear and stated such, they no longer have to follow any of the rules. So this little matter of, the amounts of material you wouldn't know about being stolen is not just a terrorist problem, it's a state proliferation problem. And if you think that isn't important, I have two words for you. Iran and East Asia, that's three.
Oh, sorry.
And then later, I don't know, Turkey, so. But it isn't just for crazy people with funny ski masks. If countries have an interest in it. Okay, now, on that upbeat note, we thought we'd talk about the most ambiguous case, South Africa. Jody went out her way to take this. It's a bit of a tar baby because people don't like talking about South Africa, including the South Africans in the IEA. And that's why don't you start?
Exactly. So let me kind of start with the context, which is that the South African apartheid government dismantled their program around the time that revelations about the Iraqi nuclear program came into being. And there begun a process of navel gazing within the IAEA member state community about how Iraqis could have put one past IAEA inspectors and what they needed to do to fix the inspection program. So it was around this time that the South Africans decided unilaterally to give up their nuclear program. So that's kind of the context. I'd ask everyone to remember three dates when thinking about this particular program: 1989, 1991, and 1993. So back in 1989, the apartheid government in South Africa began to see the writing on the wall that the regime was going to fall apart, that majority rule was going to take place. So the thinking was, let's get rid of the nuclear weapons program. We don't want it in the hands of the ANC. There's no longer a justification for it. Let's just kind of get rid of it. So right after the president of the time, F.W. de Klerk, came into office, he made this decision. We're going to get rid of the nuclear weapons program. He directed his inner circle at the Atomic Energy Commission to draw up plans to do this, getting rid of the material, getting rid of the equipment, getting rid of the documentation. And so this took several years. While this was going on, the South African government acceded to the IAEA as a non-nuclear weapons state. That was 1991. 2 years after that was when F.W. de Klerk actually publicly announced that the South African government had created a nuclear weapons deterrent, 6 gun-type nuclear weapons, each with 55 kgs of HEU, but that they had decided to dismantle them and dismantle the program. He actually made this announcement to Parliament. Interestingly, this announcement was made while there was an IAEA team on the ground in South Africa. I tell you this because, and I also tell you this as someone who's worked very, very closely with the IAEA in the past. You've got a team on the ground, you're inspecting what are allegedly these civilian programs or these civilian facilities, and the very same people who literally the day before said, oh, we don't have a nuclear weapons program, the day after said, we actually do, let's show you, we'll show you what's left. So to me, that was sort of a, how do you build confidence vis-a-vis the IAEA team that you're telling the truth? So that's number one. Number two is the fact that when de Klerk decided to get rid of the program, not only were the facilities completely decommissioned, or mostly decommissioned, and the material presumably disposed of by downblending, or we don't know. But on top of that, most of the documentation was destroyed. So when the IAEA was made apprised of this big announcement, and they supplemented their team with weapons experts, as opposed to those who examine civilian facilities, a lot of what they needed to look for wasn't actually there. And so they had to rely on the very same people who had lied to them, essentially, in the past, to tell them what was there, how much material was produced, what kinds of equipment they had, etc. So the agency began their inspections and in fact had to reproduce a lot of the documentation and come up with some of the material balances because the documentation was not there. At that time, in fact, there was a big debate within the US government about whether or not the South Africans had deliberately destroyed the documentation because they didn't want people to know how much material they had generated, or because they were trying to be careful so that the plans didn't get out to those who had nefarious plans.
Was
So-
the case of the IAEA inspecting the wrong sites, or inspecting the right sites but not knowing what they were looking at or what to look for?
I think it was neither. I think it was a matter of the access that South Africa was giving to the IAEA. And the agency, at that time, I mentioned the Iraqi situation because what was begun after the Iraq revelations came to pass was that the IAEA needed enhanced capabilities. So that even if they went into a country and the country said, oh, we don't have a nuclear weapons program, and look at our nice civilian nuclear plant and our spent fuel pond and all of that, the agency at that time did not have the capability to do environmental sampling downstream from facilities, or to in any way figure out if there were facilities that were there that they weren't being shown or that had been dismantled. So I would argue that they were being shown what they thought was supposed to be there and what the South African government was showing to them. But because at that time that's what they were instructed to do, and because their ability to do enhanced inspections was limited, they were kind of hamstrung regardless. Does that make any sense? So I do think had this situation come to pass a couple of years ago, a lot of the information that the South African government decided not to disclose, they would have been forced to disclose. And I would argue there because confidence building is such an important part of drawing down a nuclear weapons arsenal or securing nuclear material, sort of the so-called bomb in the basement scenario. So in this case, the South African government refused to disclose how much fissile material it had generated, with the claim that, well, this is a non-proliferation concern, so we don't want to talk about it. Whether or not the IAEA came up with the right kinds of conclusions about how much material, I don't know. The reporting has never been made publicly available. If any of you know how the IAEA functions, the information that they have for a member state is kept safeguards confidential unless the member state chooses to make it public. And South Africa never did, even after the ANC government came to power.
So the biggest success in nuclear security is classified, none of your business. And we don't really want to tell you whether it's as sound as it needs to be.
Yeah.
So that's the good news.
Yeah. I would add to that allegations that even the accounting that the South Africans did at the time of their program being active was determined to be not so good by the very people that ran the program. Waldo Stumpf at the time was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, and he was quoted after the disclosure as saying, boy, essentially the IAEA really had its work cut out for them because, record keeping wasn't so great. So not only did they destroy the existing records, but even those records weren't so good. So to me, I can't even imagine what the agency came up with and how they concluded in 1995 to the satisfaction of the Board of Governors and General Conference of the IAEA that yes, we are satisfied that this program has been dismantled and that all of the material has been down blended and been adequately stored.
By the way, that has not changed. In other words, they may have improved their accounting and all that, but the attitude that once a decision is made at the Board of Governors that we're gonna go one way or the other, once that's in motion, boy, they go there probably no matter what. And that's a problem.
And I do think that there hasn't been a taste to revisit this particular case. First of all, it's a long time ago now, it's 20 years. But on top of that, the South African government currently holds itself up as a beacon of non-proliferation. They basically say, we are totally open. We have our Kubert reactor. We've got rid of our weapons program. We're the good guys. And really, there's no inclination for us. There's no geopolitical reason for us to build a nuclear weapons program again. So,
Jody,
why bother?
look at all about the more recent incident, Pelindaba.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I
Yeah.
did. Not part of the paper.
Right.
But yes, there was some material that went missing. There was a break-in at the Pelindaba facility. That's a very fascinating story, in fact, and there are allegations of a government cover-up in that regard. But getting back to the previous situation, I would also add two things. Number one, the workers under this program, once the program was dismantled, number one, needed jobs. And in fact, several years later, a number of them popped up in the AQCon network. Oops. Because, you gotta make a buck, right? So that wasn't, again, the subject of the paper, but in my research I discovered that in fact there was a bit of a brain drain problem there. That's number one. Number two is that in terms of disclosing information to the IAEA and being truthful with the inspectors, many of these workers had to sign non-disclosure agreements in perpetuity to not talk about the work that they had done or what they had seen in order to get their pensions. So for me, my conclusion basically is that the dismantlement of the program and the inspections by the IAEA frankly raised more questions than they answered. And if this case had come about a couple of years ago, certainly in the post 9/11 universe and our concern over nuclear terrorism, I can't imagine that the way they had done things would have sufficed.
Henry, if I can interrupt, thank you very much, Jody. Adam and I have at most 15 minutes before we have to run upstairs, and I don't want to lose the continuity of the discussion. I'll come back afterwards, but maybe we can get to, I've already to some good things we're doing, and then
jump ahead of the kibitzers. We have two professional kibitzers who pay to kibitz on these things, and we will kibitz. But how about some bottom line? If I was going to list 4 things, and by the way, everyone else can weigh in because it's not the burden of this book to be positive, but I would say 4 things. First, we need to get back to our Nancy Reagan roots of just saying no to reprocessing. There is no economic, technical reason for you to be playing around with plutonium-based fuels. This is different than enriching uranium. There's an argument there, and it's compelling. This one's not only not compelling, it's really something you need to double down on. This would suggest that anyone in the room who has backed legislation known as 1280 or now 3766, you get a gold star. That legislation says, there ought to be a standard that when we do nuclear cooperation and when we talk to other nuclear suppliers, we should encourage them to follow the following standards. When you do nuclear cooperation, you should extract a promise from the customer that they will not make nuclear fuel. Now, standards like laws are meant to be broken, and if the State Department says, well, we just couldn't and we shouldn't, and they can make the argument, okay, but you have to vote on it. Now, if you think that's so crazy, think about the Indian deal, which many of your comrades at least supported. So it isn't impossible to break a standard, but we don't have one in law right now.
You flesh out the preliminary process.
Well, when you believe, as some have ever since 1945 in the nuclear industry, that you're running out of uranium, you argue that what you need to do to keep nuclear power alive is take 99.3% of the uranium that's extant in the world, it's called U-238, and irradiate it in a reactor and get fissile material known as plutonium, which is pretty good for making bombs. And you take that and you recycle it in your reactors, and then you get, if you will, 100-fold increase in the amount of energy you can release. Now, there's only one problem. A, we're not running out of uranium at all, and B, this costs a bazillion extra dollars beyond what nuclear power already costs. So you can certainly defer this for quite a while. Now, if you don't, then you have to say yes to South Korea, and South Korea, if it does it, is certainly going to prompt Japan to do it, and if Japan does it, well, then
Tell us a
China
little
has to
more
do
about
more.
why the reprocessed fuel is more dangerous in terms of proliferation.
Any grade of plutonium, if boosted with tritium fuel, can make perfectly decent, reliable nuclear weapons of pretty sporty yields going into the hundreds. Okay, and so this idea that none of it's useful because it's reactor grade, and I won't, please don't drag me into that unless you want to meet in your office, which I'll be happy to do. Bottom line is, it's bomb material. And the fact of the matter is, there have been articles, which I can forward to you recently, where the Japanese have let slip through senior officials that, of course, their reprocessing program is a military hedge against the Chinese. The South Koreans have let it be known that they would like to recycle to make sure that they don't fall behind the Japanese. You get the picture. So that one is an economic non-proliferation no-brainer. It would seem like the legislative action would be to support Brad Sherman and Ross Laitman's legislation, which I know at least one of you, and maybe both of you, did before. So, not so bad. We talked about sharing accountancy procedures. You may well be doing that, but you'd want to be doing that even now with the Russians. And dare I say it, Chinese, which might be a tough sell. Here's another one that someone has done, but it didn't get done. You might want to have an evaluation of how good the IAEA's ability to keep track of things is. I've been on 2 commissions over 10 years, and suggested each time, everyone applauds, yay. It even gets into state authorization bills, which we know never pass. And everyone goes, yay, and then nothing happens.
When's the last time we had a state authorization bill?
Well, but more important, when was the last time we had an appropriations bill? I say.
Well, we're getting better.
7 years ago.
Well, if you get better, put that in again.
Yeah.
I think the other idea, which I think at least one of you have pursued, is just say nix to mox. The administration actually is backing out of this. Maybe you should make it easier for them. You pay the bills. Stop paying for that.